So, before I cut out for the evening, I want to talk about Belarus. It's something that people are concerned about. And up front, I want to say this. The material support, which is all of the things that Belarus has given to Russia, whether it's equipment, fuel, anything that either was stored by Russia or was purchased or designated to be used for the common defense of Belarus, Russia, is now moving into Russian hands for their fight in Ukraine. Their Belarusians are giving the Russians equipment. That is significant. That is what Russia needs, is equipment. They have the people, albeit untrained or poorly trained at best, but one of their Achilles heels right now is not having proper equipment. Well, Belarus is starting to give them some. What you can kind of determine from this, though, is that because this equipment is leaving Belarus to go to Russian hands to fight on Ukrainian fronts, likely in the Donbass region, whether it's Lyman or Kherson, or even in the Russians' offensive operations near Bakhmut, which they're still trying to conduct offensive operations. In fact, it's the only place in Ukraine Russia is still technically on the offensive, even though it's a pretty stagnated battlefield there. But because all this equipment is leaving Belarus and heading to the Ukrainian front for Russia, it's pretty unlikely that it's going to be used for a Belarusian joint invasion into Kyiv. What's likely happening is it's not necessarily a feint, it's just standard kind of misdirection operations where they want to force Kyiv to consider the possibility that Russia could use Belarus once again as a point to launch an offensive back into the city of Kyiv. And it falls in line with their recent missile attacks, where they're trying to soften up quote-unquote military targets, despite the fact, like I said in my previous video, that they're not really hitting any military targets in and around Kyiv and Kharkiv. So what they're doing is they're creating a kind of a focus point that the Ukrainians must take seriously. So they have to maintain troop deployments in and around Kyiv in order to ensure that it's protected, and rightfully so. However, when you do that, troops have to be kept off the front lines. And Russia's trying to relieve the pressure on their front lines from these massive Ukrainian offensives that have been pretty successful. So that's what you're seeing right now from Belarus. Belarus is supporting Ukraine, supporting Russia, absolutely. They're giving them ammunition, something like 492 tons of ammunition from the Belarusian 43rd Missile and Ammunition Storage Arsenal. Notice the word missile. So remember in my previous video I just posted that where I was talking about how Russia is going to continue to probably escalate along the line of effort that is missile attacks, whether it's on military or energy or civilian infrastructure. That's where that's going to go. 13 additional trains were provided with weapons and equipment coming from 5 different Belarusian locations. So the good news is I and many other experts don't think Belarus is going to get into this war to fight, despite the fact that Putin and Lukashenko jointly said that they were going to create a joint unit together. They never said what they were going to do with that unit. They said they were going to deploy them. Well, they can deploy them within Belarus. They could deploy them to Russia. Saying something's deploying doesn't mean it's deploying to the war. So, and they know that. So what's happening, though, is it's making Kyiv rethink, maybe we need to keep a lot more forces around the city. And that's a very probably shrewd assessment to do so. You probably want to make sure, because if you show weakness around the capital city, they will move in and try to do something. So Lukashenko is in a precarious position, is the other reason I don't think Belarus is going to get involved unless Vladimir Putin basically tells Lukashenko, get involved or your regime is over. And the Lukashenko, this war is not as popular in Belarus by a long shot as it is in Russia. The Belarusians are actually quite tied to the Ukrainians in a lot of ways. That's why there's Belarusian units fighting for Ukraine. They're volunteers, obviously, fighting for Ukraine against Russia. So I don't think that Belarus is going to get involved. I think that Lukashenko's in a precarious position, that he is in more of a, I wouldn't say dangerous, but unstable position than even Putin is. There was, if you remember, a few years back, there was an attempt to overthrow him within the Belarusian population. It wasn't even really an overthrow, it was an election that he was going to lose. And then the Russians, he basically rigged it, and the Russians came in and secured it for him. And now Lukashenko is essentially beholden to Putin. But I think that he's only beholden to Putin to an extent. I think if it means his position as the head of state of Belarus or if it means his own life, he will just roll the dice and tell Putin no. And so far, all of the no's that likely have come from Lukashenko have been received by Putin. Whether it was received well or not, Putin hasn't necessarily applied pain to Lukashenko. And I think maybe this might be the most painful point, because Belarus has been talking about their concerns with Poland and the rhetoric of the Poland invading, or the Baltic nations wanting to overthrow him, or even Ukraine is going to attack them, which is nonsense. They have enough to deal with when it comes to Russia. That he wants to build up his military base so that he can respond to such things. Problem is it's hard to build up your military base when you have to give all your shit to Putin and the Kremlin and Russia, because they've been blown into the World War II level equipment at this point. So I think there was a very terse conversation probably between Putin and Lukashenko, and Putin said, at the very least, you will give me equipment to support, because that is what I need. I have the people. They might be terribly trained, but I have the people. You give me equipment and ammunition so that I can at least prolong this campaign, hopefully in order to apply enough pressure to get Ukraine and the West to capitulate in some way. So that's my thoughts on Belarus. Again, I don't think that Belarus is going to attack Ukraine. I really don't think Ukraine is going to attack Belarus. I think it's a lot of geopolitical and geostrategic positioning to try to cause different effects on the actual battlefield. So that's where I'm at on that.